Thank you ever so much for the invitation, and I hope I'll live up to your expectations. What I have prepared for you is about 81 slides. And some of it is quite technical, other things are more accessible, but I've tried to make it as accessible as possible because I didn't know what to expect in a certain sense. But I'm very proud to present these results here because, of course, many of you, I can't see anybody right now in this room, but yes, one, yes, two, yes, sorry, yes. Yes, and yes. So, yeah. So, thank you ever so much for your eyes and for your data. And yes, so I'm going to talk about error recognition during post-editing with data that was produced here at the DGT. But I'll also give you a bit of an overview because the results have to be contextualized. And yeah, so the outline of the talk is the following. So first I'll talk about products aspects, so a corpus study of actual texts that have been produced here. And there we will look at an automatic error analysis, a manual error analysis, and some research questions. And in particular, what we're interested in is what kind of errors are produced by the NMT that was used back in 2019, at the beginning of the year, I think. And in particular, what do post-editors working here at the DGT and the revisers of the post-edited text, what do they actually correct? So that was our question in the product study. And the eye tracking study I'll introduce a bit later, with a bit more background and detail. But yeah, one follows from the other. So for the corpus study, it started with a corpus collection. It's not a huge corpus, but we had to take a few things into consideration. So we have in total 24 texts, which makes up about 902 segments. So for MT standards, it's a very small corpus. But because we did the manual annotation, this was necessary so that it's actually doable. This were in total about 18,000 tokens in the English source text, and then we had one NMT, so a neural machine translation output, one post-edited German NMT, so the NMTPE, and a revision of these roughly 15,000 tokens. So, yeah. A word. Yes. Yes, sorry, yes. Thank you for the question, yes. So that is the corpus.
Sorry, we didn't hear the questions.
Yes, so the question was, what is a token? And I said it's roughly a word. Did that arrive?
Thank you.
Okay, good. Yes, so here you have an image again. So we had the NMT output and we had the post-edited, so NMTPE, that's what we're calling it. So the post-edited NMT. And for these, for this comparison between the raw machine translation output and the post-edited, we had an automatic analysis and a manual analysis, and the same thing for the comparison between the post-edited texts and the revised texts, the final texts that were published or used further. This is the rough outline there. We did the automatic error annotation with Hjerson. I'll tell you more about that in just a second, and the manual error annotation with MQM, which is a fairly standard framework for analyzing errors in post-editing and also translation. And Hjerson, developed by Popovic in 2011, automatically identifies 5 error types. It identifies inflection errors, word order, so reordering, that's how they call it, but essentially word order errors, missing words, extra words, and what they call lexical choice. It is widely used to, for example, compare statistical machine translation with neural MT. Here a study by Terral and colleagues from 2017, and you can very clearly see that, at least for German, for English into German, we get an improvement of 13 roughly 30% less inflection errors in NMT, about 22% less word order errors. But in terms of lexical errors, there's not a great reduction, at least in 2017. So things develop very fast. But anyway, this is the kind of tool that we've used for the automatic error annotation. So just to give you a more detailed example of what we call an inflectional error. So the German text is in gray there, and I've given you a gloss, a very bad one, so I'm not a very good translator, to be honest. But anyway, you can see that Vereinfachungen in German, simplifications is my back translation, is in plural. And the post-edited version then is simplification in the singular, so that would be an inflectional error. So it's essentially the right translation. There's just a little bit of a hiccup in terms of what goes on. Then we have word order errors. Again, a very, very literal translation here, just for those who don't speak German. The term that we're interested in here is Verbesserung der Rechtsetzung. Better regulation in red, so the machine translation puts it roughly there, and the post-editor then puts it right back right at the end of that part of the sentence. So that would be the correct translation, but in the wrong place, word order error. And then we have lexical errors. So in German, die Kommission stellt diese Prioritäten jährlich, poses these priorities would be a bad back translation. And die Kommission setzt, so the Commission sets these priorities, is what the post-editor corrects. So clearly this is a different word, it's a lexical error, and that is annotated automatically. And this is what we got in terms of the total counts, the raw counts. So you can see here the inflectional errors are very few. In blue you have the corrections that the post-editor made, and in gray you have the corrections that the reviser made on top of the post-edited version. So very few inflectional errors. In the post-edited version, some more word order errors. Missing words are also quite frequent. Extra words are quite frequent. But lexical errors explodes. So 3049 in percentage, we have in the post-edited version, we have nearly 50% are lexical errors. And in the revised version, very similar. So clearly, these lexical issues are a problem for the NMT, at least in 2019. The versions that we've been given very kindly by the DGT. So, but the automatic annotation is of course error prone, so we decided to have a closer look at what's going on inside these, and we looked at both extra words and lexical errors, because sometimes the machine thinks it's an extra word and actually it's a lexical error. And we used MQM, or a version of MQM, and we looked at these categories. So mistranslation, I don't think I really need to explain that, but essentially it's a wrong translation. Terminology, which is very close to mistranslation, of course, where a domain-specific word is translated with a term other than the one expected for the domain or otherwise specified. Then we have something that is called phraseology, unidiomatic. So it is correct grammatically, but not idiomatic. And then register or style, where the text uses a level of formality or which is higher or lower than required by the specifications or for that text. Spelling issues and function words. So function words are things like preposition, auxiliary verbs, or articles, which are used incorrectly. Again, examples here for register. Gemeinsam kann Europa stark sein. So these are examples that actually have been produced by the NMT and the post editors here. So gemeinsam is translated as jointly in the back translation, and the post editor then changes it to geeint, so united, and we would call this a register error or a stylistic error. Then we have a function word. So here, dies wird ein wichtiger Teil des whatever. So in English, that would be something like this. This will be an important part of. And the post editor makes it a pronoun, so it will be an important part of. Mistranslation, so Zinsen in the NMT, and the post editor, so interest rates, Zinsen could be translated as interest rates, changes that to Ains. So this is clearly a mistranslation because interest can, of course, be both, but in this case it's, yeah. So, if we look at the total amount, you can already see that register errors make up a huge proportions of those corrected by the post editors. There's some mistranslations going on, some terminology going on, but the biggest problem seems to be register. Some function words are also problematic, but register is a huge issue. If we look at that in terms of percentage of the total error count, again we see that register in the post-edited text about 60%, in the revised even 70%. So yeah, so that was essentially the product analysis from the corpus, and then we looked at the effect of the number of errors per sentence in the NMT, in the raw machine translation text, and to what extent they have an effect on the number of errors per sentence in the revised version. And we can see a very small but significant effect, so that the more errors the post editors corrected here in terms of register or style, the more errors the revisers of that very same sentence would correct in that same sentence. It is a very small effect, so for every error that a post editor corrects in the raw machine translation output, the revisers correct 0.05 errors in that post edited text. Anyway, it's significant, and we find the same kind of thing, the same kind of effect for mistranslation in terminology. Yes, so we can conclude here that the most troublesome aspect for NMT here at the DGT is register, and there's a small influence of mistranslation or terminology errors and also of register errors on NMTPE behavior. But this product study was only the baseline, or sort of the first step towards understanding how errors are recognized. So we know that the experts here do a very good job in finding those, in spotting those mistakes, but our question is, how do they do it? And that is why we carried out an eye tracking study. But before we launch into the eye tracking data, I need to give you some background in terms of what eye tracking actually is. So I think here you can't see it really well. Hopefully in Brussels you can see it better. So there should be concentric circles. So there's a small one here in the middle, one there's a little bit larger, and then a very large one. So when we look into the world, or on a page, or on a...
So that people see you there.
Yes, okay. So it's very difficult to talk in two directions at the same time. So if you look through the room or onto a computer screen, it feels as if everything you're seeing is always in focus. It isn't. Your brain tricks you and makes you think that everything is in focus. If you just look around the room, it feels as if everything is in focus, but it isn't. And actually, it's a very small area that is actually properly in focus. And it is the Foveal, so the central area in your vision is in focus, and the focus degrades the further away you are from that central area in your vision. And so what we process in terms of written words is actually mostly what is situated in the Foveal. That is why we have to move the eyes across the screen, or the page, right? Otherwise we could take in the whole thing at once. So in the parafovea, we can still guess or have a rough idea what it says there, but the further away you get from the center, the more difficult it becomes. And in the periphery, it's virtually impossible to understand anything that is on there on the page. So what is it that we process in this central area in the Foveal? A very well-established effect is word length. So the longer the word, the more difficult it is to process it. Frequency, phonological aspects, morphology, ambiguity, and also predictability. And there's a long list of other aspects that are processed in the Foveal. There are what we call fixations. So when we look at, for example, the screen, the eyes are relatively still at certain moments. And that is what we call a fixation. And that is interesting because we can only process information while the eyes are still. So when we move the eyes from one word to the next, in that movement we can't process visual information. And so the average fixation duration during normal reading is something between 200 and 250 milliseconds. This is very little time per word. So it's about a quarter of a second or even less. And within this 200 and 250 milliseconds, we recognize the word. So a lot of things go on in these 250 milliseconds. And if we think about translation, even more. Then we know that not every word is read. So about 85% of all words in a written text are actually fixated. The rest are skipped. Function words only receive a fixation 35% of the time. And if it's a very short word, like a preposition in or something like that, it's only 25% of the time that we actually fixate. And that is because these other processes that predict the upcoming text make it possible to jump over that word. And also because in the paraphobia, what I showed you earlier, we can sort of guess the shape of that word, and if it coincides with our predictive system, then we just skip it. Yes, and then we have regressions. So in languages that read from left to right, the eyes move, obviously, from left to right. And then if they move back, we count that a regression. And that's interesting because during a regression typically occurs in normal reading because something has failed. There's an ambiguity that we need to resolve. We need to reanalyze something, so a regression generally signifies that something went wrong. And about 15% of all saccades, so the saccades are the movements between the fixations. And this is the distribution of fixation. So the average is between 200 and 250 milliseconds. But you can get very short fixations around 100 milliseconds or even shorter, or very long ones of 600 or even longer fixations. So we're talking about milliseconds. Yeah? So this is still very fast. And now I need to tell you a little bit about eye movement measures because I'm going to dwell on these quite a bit. So here we have a sentence: the knight attacked the windmill on his donkey, and the circles are fixations, and the lines between the circles are what we call saccades. So we had a first fixation on the, then a slightly longer fixation on knight, a third fixation on attacked, because it is short and predictable, is skipped. Then we get a fourth fixation on windmill, and then we get a second fixation on windmill. So 4 and 5. The first one is relatively short, the second one is a little bit longer, and then we get a regression to attacked. Presumably because the reader asked themselves, a knight attacks a windmill? So hold on, is that really what is going on here? So we get a regression to attacked, and then a seventh fixation on windmill, so a third actually on windmill, and then the reading goes on until the end of the sentence. So the area of interest here on windmills, if we only look at the reading times for windmill, we get so the fixation number 4 would be the first contact with that word. And that is, on average, 250 milliseconds. It is the first contact with that word, and normally, and very often, it is sufficient to understand and recognize that word. But here, as I said, we have a second fixation. So the sum of these two fixations, 4 and 5, because they occurred one right after the other, is what we call a gaze duration or first pass duration. So two fixations on the same word before we look anywhere else in the sentence. So the first fixation is the earliest contact. The gaze duration, so the sum of these two fixations, is a little bit later in the processing of this word. Windmill is a relatively rare word, so it's difficult to process, and therefore maybe, and also it's relatively long, we get a second fixation. Then the time that passes between the first fixation and 4, 5, 6, and then 7. So the regression until we move on to the right. That is the regression path duration. So as I said earlier, we get a problem of some sort. We need a regression, and the time that passes between the first contact and the time that we move on to the right is what we call a regression path. So the time that it takes the reader to recover from the problem, because we assume that if they move on to the right, they have recovered. It's fine. So that is a slightly later stage of processing. The earliest is the first fixation. Then we get the gaze duration or first pass duration, so the sum of all fixations on that word before they move anywhere else. Then the regression path duration, and the latest measure is the total reading time. So that would be the sum of fixation 4, 5, and 7. So here we only get 3 fixations on windmill, but it would be possible, and especially in translation, people spend a lot of time reading the material. So you get words that get, 25 fixations, because they go back and back to that word again and again. So that is the latest stage in the processing. Why is that interesting? Because these early processes, 250 milliseconds, that's very, very short. It's a quarter of a second. And in that quarter of a second, what you manage is to not only understand that word, but also translate it. But a lot of the processes that go on in this first fixation duration are relatively automatic. So you have very little control whether you look at a word for 240 or 260 milliseconds. You cannot possibly control that. Whether you fixate a word a second time, you already have a little bit more control. And whether you regress, again, you have more control. And then if you decide to look at that word 15 times, you can decide that. So the early processes are more automatic, and the late processes are a lot less automatic. I should have said that the longer you look at a word, the more difficult, of course, it is to process that, and that is the base assumption that we have here. So that's a squiggle, isn't it? You could start and maybe read an R here, something like that. And maybe this could be an S if you think that I'm a first grader or something. But anyway, so when you see a word, be it written by somebody's hand or on a printed page on a computer screen, first of all, you have visual information, something like this. And eventually you come up with a word. Yeah? But initially, it's just visual information, just like anything else in the world. And this translation process from the visual to the letter features takes about 50 milliseconds. So the models that try to understand how reading or word recognition works assume that we have this visual input, which is translated into visual features, which is then translated into letter information, which finally gets access to the orthographic lexicon. And once we have orthography, we have phonology, and then we have semantics, so the meaning you've understood. So this model is serial in the sense that you go from bottom to top, and once one process is finished, you move on to the next. That's the idea. But there's a whole range of aspects that need to be put into relation. So we have the oculomotor control processes. So you need to plan a saccade. So you need time to actually say, well, I want to move from this position in this word to this position in this word. And that takes time. Again, about 50 milliseconds. And it requires an effort. Then we need to control where our cognitive attention is actually. So we can look at something and think of something else. Not that you're doing that right now. You need to process that visual information, and then we have what we call language. So all of that needs to be coordinated. And how that happens is the question. So this is a model by somebody called Reichle from 2011. It's the easy reader, and it starts with the input of the visual information. And immediately after the letters are sort of identified, the next saccade is being planned. So that happens immediately, and there's a labile stage where we can still change. So we could suddenly think, oh, maybe I stay longer on this word, or maybe I move on to the next. And then at some point that cannot be changed and has to be executed. But simultaneously, the word recognition process starts, and we have first what they call a familiarity check. So we roughly know what this word is, but not exactly. And once we have lexical access, this system tells cognitive attention, move on to the next word. So we're still focusing, in this case, cat, but we're already pre-processing chased, or we're still looking at this one. And then the integration in the prior context happens after that. So this is one way of and it's a modular and a serial model, one way of thinking about this process. Now, just to give you an indication of the kind of things that go on during these early stages of word recognition. This is an ERP study, so where people get wires, e.g., so you get a cap on and wires and so on. And they showed participants actual words, so actual concrete words, pseudo words, and illegal non-words, so essentially letters. And they also showed them alphanumeric symbols and just abstract forms to see if that had an effect. And it did. So after about 170 milliseconds here, you can see there's a difference in the ERP component. So after about 170 milliseconds, you know, well, this is actually something that could be a word, or it's not. And this is a study where they showed participants complete sentences and looked at the effect of frequency and predictability. So word frequency is calculated on the basis of huge corpora. So you look how often does this word occur, and a word like even is relatively frequent, short has a medium frequency, and hustle is relatively rare. And again, after about 140 to 200 milliseconds, this frequency had an effect. Yeah. So frequency, what is that? So you have a huge corpus in your mind, and within about 150 milliseconds, you have a sense of how often this word appears in your mental lexicon, which is a lot. Predictability, on the other hand, occurs a little bit later. So predictability in this case is measured in close frequency. So you give participants, not those that participate in the ERP study, others, you give them, he had the habit off, and ask them to guess the next word. So pacing, nobody guessed that, or nobody would guess that, but smoking, about 27% of the people guess smoking. So smoking has a predictability of 0.27. And this difference in the predictability appears after about 300 milliseconds. You can see the difference here. So again, 300 milliseconds is still a very early process, but you can see that this predictability occurs a little bit later. So, more modern models assume that the whole thing is interactive. So, the top-level processes such as semantics and predictability and all these other high-level processes impinge on the early processes, so that it's not only a bottom-up process where you translate the visual features into letters and orthography and so on, but also a top-down process which affects the very bottom. So it's interactive. Although the discussion is still going on. So, why am I telling you all this? Because during word recognition, expectations or predictions interact with what the eyes encounter. That is what we assume. So, you have a model of that text that you are translating, that you're post-editing in your mind, and that model, that expectation, interacts with how you react to it. And of course, an error in the, say, machine translation process contravenes these expectations. And so the error recognition tells us something about the kind of expectations that you have, implicit expectations that you have, and the time course. So when does this error pop up in your behavior? So when do you actually recognize that there is an error? Tells us something about how automatic these processes are. So if it occurs very early, we assume the error recognition process is relatively automatic. If it only shows up very late, we assume that it is not entirely automatic in your mind. And then the kind of error that shows up either early or late tells us something about the nature of these processes, these error recognition processes. So I told you I would give you some background. This is a study which we actually did a while back when SMT was still state-of-the-art. But it's interesting in terms of the context and also to understand the results here at the DGT. We had 60 participants, 20 innocent English bilinguals, 20 German innocent bilinguals, and 20 professional translators. They had to read source and target sentences, and they had to simply spot the mistakes. And they had to click on the word that they thought had a mistake, an error. They did not actually type, so they just had to click. And we included typical SMT errors, so word order was difficult for SMT, mistranslation and misalignment, so number tense alignment, for example. And then we had two control conditions, which I'll talk about here. So we had a transposition of letters. So you can see there, this guy refused to recognize, so it should actually be recognized. Right? Word order, Pamela Anderson will be the Mary Virgin in a Christmas TV show, so it should actually be Virgin Mary, of course. Mistranslation, so similar to what I showed you earlier. So the German says interrupted and the MT produces cancelled. This is a clear case of mistranslation. And then a difficult transposition of letters where we have craved instead of carved. That's it. Carved instead of craved. Yeah. So the difficult transposition actually produces a legal word, whereas the easy transposition doesn't. And then misalignment, we have have instead of has. And so participants saw either the Mary Virgin or they saw the Virgin Mary, and of course the Virgin Mary is the correct one. And then there's 4 possible interactions with the sentence. Either they can click on the error and say, well, this is wrong, the Mary Virgin is wrong, or they can not recognize the error, or if they see the Virgin Mary, say that it is correct and not click on it, or they can click on the correct word and say this is wrong. One that we think is incorrect, they think is incorrect. But the only thing that we're interested in is the comparison between Mary Virgin and Virgin Mary. So anything else we discarded. So we only looked at true positives and true negatives. So if they said there is an error and we also thought there is an error, then we use that sentence. And if they did not say there is an error, and we also said there is no error. That is what we compare. Okay? So this is the 60 participants together, and it's the first fixation duration. So we have here the transposition, which is easy, and word order, mistranslation, transposition difficult, and misalignment. And you can see here that if there was an error, the pink line, they looked at these words like recognized for 46 milliseconds longer in a first contact with that word. So clearly something was going on there. But this is all participants together, the innocent bilinguals and the professionals. If we separate them, so this is the English bilinguals, the German bilinguals, and the professionals. We can see some differences, especially for the professionals. And if we look at that closer, we can see that the professionals also recognized word order errors early and the difficult transposition, so something like carved and craved, within the first fixation duration. The bilinguals did not. You see here, there's no effect. Absolutely no difference. But the professionals clearly showed very early error recognition processes for word order and for the difficult transposition and the easy transposition. Now we're at the gaze duration, so one step later. Yeah? So the first contact is the first fixation duration, and if there is a second fixation on that very same word before they move anywhere else, the sum of those two fixations is what we have here. And you can see across errors, all errors, so the easy transposition, word order, mistranslation, difficult transposition, and misalignment, all lead to early effects in this gaze duration. And we can see, if we separate the groups again, that the effect is actually driven by the professionals. So we can see that the bilinguals, so the English bilinguals show a little bit of an effect here, the German bilinguals don't, and the professionals show in the gaze duration an effect for nearly all error categories apart from misalignment. So clearly the competence here plays a role, not only the linguistic competence, but also the professional competence. And this is the regression path duration. You remember I told you that from the first contact through the regression until they move beyond that word to the right, all errors lead to longer regression path durations. And if we look at the groups separately again we show, we can see that there are differences, but really what we're interested in is the professionals, and we can see that very clearly all errors lead to longer regression path durations. So the comparison is always the blue against the pink, and we can see that, for example, for the easy transposition, the recovery from that error takes about 400 milliseconds. For misalignment errors, it's only 86% milliseconds. But if we look at the errors that are really interesting, which is word order, mistranslation, and misalignment, they are different, but only numerically. So statistically, the difference between this difference, and this difference is not significant. So they treat it essentially in the regression path duration, all the interesting errors, so the typical SMT errors, word order, mistranslation, and misalignment, the same. No difference. If we move into the total reading time, so you remember the very late process where we sum all the fixation on that word until they move to the next sentence. And you can see here that per word is something between 2,000 and 1,000 milliseconds, so 1 second to 2 seconds. And so very strong effects for all errors, of course. And if we look at the professional separately again, here we see something different. So word orders are resolved in total reading time within 1 second, roughly. Mistranslation is slightly more difficult, so we are here at roughly 1,400 milliseconds, and misalignment is clearly the most difficult. So we see a clear hierarchy in terms of the conscious and controlled effort that is spent in order to decide whether this is a correct or mistaken, so the wrong word. And this is clearly most difficult for the misalignment errors. So to sum up, in the early processes for the professionals, we see effects for word order. A little bit later in the gaze duration, we also see effects for mistranslation. In the regression path duration, misalignment also pops up, but a hierarchy, so a difference between the different error types, only appears in the very late processes in total reading time. So, the next study is human errors. So these were texts that were produced by humans, so translation from scratch. And we used those errors to essentially study the same thing. We used 23 professional translators, 15 students, and participants read short texts, about 150 words, and corrected the mistakes that they found. And the kind of errors we introduced there were orthography, grammar, sense, omission, consistency, and coherence. Again, these were real errors from actual humans. And so orthography, so there's a P missing in Kranken Pfleger, so it needs to be Pfleger. Grammar, so mod instead of des mordes, so genitive marking is missing. A sense error, climate protection instead of climate change. Consistency, so within the text they either used kosten, so costs, or prices, and coherence here, a conjunction that is misused. So those were the kinds of errors that we studied here. And again, so participants either saw climate protection or climate change, and climate protection was wrong in this context and climate change was correct. And again, they could either say, well, this is an error, climate protection should be something else, or they saw a correct word and actually didn't change it, and anything else we disregarded. And again, we compare these two. So in the first fixation, we see clear effects for orthography. So the red in this case is the incorrect word and the black is the correct word. So very large and clear effects for orthography. And the students show marginally significant effects for grammar and coherence. Shouldn't we put too much weight on these? In the gaze duration, so again, a little bit later, not the very first contact, but a little bit later, we again see very clear effects for orthography errors and not much else. In the regression path duration, students spend quite a bit of time regressing to further parts in the text, which was very surprising. So if you have a misspelled word, why do you need the context? It wasn't very clear to us. The professionals, on the other hand, go back in the sentence for coherence errors, which you would expect. Right? So if there's a coherence mistake, you go back to the context and see how you can resolve this. And for sense errors, the professionals. So clearly, it makes sense to go back in the context for sense errors. And this is the total reading time in the target text. And here, again, we see very clear effects for orthography. The professionals show no effect for consistency. So they correct these mistakes, but don't spend much time reading those words. The students, on the other hand, spend quite a bit of time on consistency errors. And the professionals spend time on grammar, whereas the students don't. And maybe the most interesting effect is the sense errors here, which the students don't spend any time on, the professionals do. And really the most interesting effect of all is here. So this is the total reading time on words aligned to those target tokens that have the error. So you have, I don't know, Krankenpfleger or climate protection in the target text, which was German, but anyway. And then the words that are aligned to that, this is the total reading time on those words. And here we see a very, very clear effect for sense errors for the professionals, and all other errors that don't spend any time in the source text, or not more than they would if there was no mistake. The students, on the other hand, spend a lot of time in the source text if there's an omission. Oops. Yeah, that's it. So, obviously we can say that orthography errors are recognized by both groups early. Students tend to reread previous text for orthography, which, as said, is not very intuitive. The professionals, on the other hand, reread previous text for sense and coherence, which again makes sense. Consistency errors show up in total reading time for the students, whereas the professionals look at grammar. And then, as I said, the most interesting effect is in terms of source text reading times, where students spend more time on all error categories apart from sense, which actually where it's important to go back to the source text, right? And the professionals only go back to the source text for those sense errors. So summarizing, we can say that students remain on the surface of the text, so they look at orthography, consistency, and grammar, and triple check consistency errors, these larger texts in total reading time. The professionals refer to the source text only when it matters most, and have a much more efficient error recognition process. And also we can summarize that the professionals are more strategic in terms of cost benefit. So of course, spending more time might lead to better performance, but is also costly in terms of time and effort. So, the first study I showed you, we looked at errors that are typical for SMT, Statistical Machine Translation. The participants were professional translators, and we had these other groups as well. The participants did not type, so they just clicked on the word. The study I just showed you looked at human errors. We had students and professionals, and participants read whole texts and corrected the mistakes. And now, the current study, we look at the errors that were produced by the NMT here, corrected by the people here. And we looked at the frequency of these errors in the wild, in the actual wild here. Yes. So just to recap, those are the errors in the manual annotation of what was corrected. And as I said, about 60% of the errors were register errors that were corrected. And for the eye tracking study, we combined mistranslation and terminology because they're often quite related. And we also looked at function words. And in this manner, we nearly looked at all error categories, at least. So this phraseology part was not very frequent, and spelling mistakes are not really an issue for a good NMT anyway. So this is what we covered in terms of the eye tracking. So we had 30 participants here from the DGT, and participants were asked to read and correct single sentences. These were 81 critical sentences. In total it was more because we also had filler sentences, but the sentences we're interested in were 81. And we had these three error categories. So function words, register words, and mistranslation or terminology. We called it misterm. And you can see that we have slightly more register errors. And the reason for this is that we hypothesized that there would be very little agreement on how to correct these mistakes. And that was actually the case. So 74% of all mistranslation and terminology errors were actually corrected. 43% of the function errors, but only 18% of those errors that had been previously corrected by you were then corrected again. And in order to have enough statistical power, we obviously needed more of those items in what we presented so that we could compare the conditions. So here another example of a function word error. The preposition für, and an is correct in this context. yeah, so again, this is what we would be comparing. For register, another example, so the back translation would be, without aiming to be exhaustive, the NMT said erschöpfend, and the post-editor corrected this to vollständig complete. This would be a register error, and a mistranslation or terminology error would be prepared and edited or erstellt, created. So, our hypotheses for this study were that function errors would be relatively easy to correct and spot. Mistranslation or terminology errors would be more difficult to spot because, of course, they take into account the source text, so they're bilingual errors in a certain sense. Register errors, on the other hand, we thought would be the most difficult errors because they're so subtle. And we also hypothesized that these function errors would pop up especially in the early measures, and the other two errors especially or only in the late measures. We didn't think the mistranslation or register errors would be spotted early. That was at least our hypothesis. And these are the first fixation durations. So all error categories are recognized, pop up in the first fixation duration. Function, words, register errors, and mistranslation terminology errors. And you can see these numbers are different, so 37, 56, and 66. Statistically, they're all the same. So all error categories show up to the same extent very early on. This was very surprising and very exciting. If we go one step later into gaze durations, exactly the same picture. So, function, register, and misterm, statistically, no difference between these differences. So, so misterm are shorter and function words are longer, but statistically it's exactly the same. Shall we have a vote? How does it look like later? In regression path duration, who thinks there's a difference? Who thinks it's going to be the same? Okay, let's have a look. Again, exactly the same. So, for function words we get 153, for register 205, for misterm 122. Statistically, there's no difference. So, all errors are treated equally, and all errors are recognized early. So, total reading time. Let's have a vote. Who thinks there's going to be a difference? A hierarchy? Come on. Nobody. Who thinks it's going to be flat? Show of hands. You can only be wrong. Okay, so once more. Who thinks there's going to be a difference? Okay, and who thinks it's going to be the same? You're right. Total reading time on the target words. Again, absolutely no difference. So again, you see numerical differences, but these are not statistically significant. And then we also have the source time, source text reading times, and there we do get a difference. And that was significant. So for function words, participants did go back for about 181 milliseconds more than they would otherwise. And for misterm, quite a bit more, so 400 milliseconds. For register errors, there's no significant difference between the reading times on correct aligned source word and incorrect aligned source words, which of course were identical in the text, right? So the correct and incorrect source word was the same, it's only the target that differs. So here we do get a difference, which is what you would expect anyway. Yeah. So, all our hypotheses down the drain. Yeah, so none of those hypotheses was substantiated. So we can conclude that there's no significant hierarchy concerning the difficulty of errors. All errors are treated equally. We can also say that, so function, register, and misterm. So low-level grammatical aspects in terms of function words, contextual aspects in terms of register, and in terms of terminology or mistranslation are treated all equally. The fact that all of these errors show up during a first fixation duration tells us something about the predictive processes which are highly developed in these participants. So my suspicion, and we did gather data from students but haven't analyzed that yet completely, is that in people who are not as expert as the translators here, we won't see those early effects. That is very much my expectation. So these predictive processes, before you even read the word, you already know what to expect. And then if you don't find it, you say, oh, what's that? That's wrong. So the difference between vollständig and, what was it? Vollständig. Schaeffer. Yeah, so that shows up within the first 250, 300 milliseconds. So the top-down processes are highly tuned to the task, of course, because of the expertise. We did one additional analysis. Obviously, I don't need to explain what décalage is, but it is often used as an indicator of cognitive effort during simultaneous interpreting. So the time between the pronunciation of a source word and the production of the aligned equivalent target word. And in translation, we calculate something very similar, which is the I key span. So the moment between the first contact with a word and the first keystroke that contributes to the translation of that very word. That is what we call the I key span. So the I key span can be seen as an indicator of certainty. So if you're very certain, it is very small. If you're very unsure, it becomes very long. Yes, and in order to understand this next slide, I need to show you a little bit more. Oops. So what you see here is certainly one word, window, right? But there's also for 40 milliseconds a different word. So some of you might be aware, but you wouldn't be able to tell what word that is, would you? So if you first see for 40 milliseconds the translation of the word window, you recognize the word window faster in comparison to a situation where you see a different word, which is not a translation of window. And this is what leads people to... Oops. It's gone.
Yes.
Okay. So the fact that such a very short presentation of a word in one language, it activates representations belonging to that word in the semantic lexicon, in the bilingual lexicon, and then when you see the word window in the target language, you already have those activations that lead then to faster recognition. So this goes to show that semantics is actually shared across languages. And the same is true to a certain extent for syntax. So cross-linguistic priming studies such as this one from 2003, participants saw first a sentence like, the waitress will bring the noisy customers a tray of drinks. Then they saw a Spanish sentence which has nothing to do semantically with the first English sentence, but has a prepositional dative. And participants were then asked to recall the first sentence, the English sentence. And if they had seen a prepositional dative in Spanish, they were more likely to recall the English sentence with a prepositional dative. So this leads people to think that syntax is actually shared across languages. So the representations for syntax are in the same way as those for semantics shared across languages. In 2013, we proposed this model of translation, which builds on these studies to argue that translation relevant and shared representations are accessed very early on during the first contact, and these early access of shared representations, both in terms of syntax and semantics, are then processed in the later stages, which are of course bidirectional, so you can read the source text and produce the target, but during revision you do the opposite. Anyway, that was the idea. And this is the data here from the DGT. So on the horizontal axis you have the duration of the first fixation. So these are very short first fixations, and these are very long first fixations. And on the vertical axis you have the I-key span. And then you have the three error types. So in green, the mistranslation and terminology, in blue, the functional words, and in pink, the register errors. So you can see that mistranslation and functional errors, functional word errors, there's a very clear relationship between the first fixation and the time it takes you to decide to actually correct that word. So if you have a very long first fixation, so if there's a large effect early on, you very immediately correct that error. And the opposite is true. So if there's a very little or no effect in the early processes, if the first fixation is very short, then the error is corrected very late. And for register errors, none of that is there. So this was the only point where we could dissociate these three error types apart from the source text reading types. Yes, so the dangers of NMT are primarily that errors are hidden, and that is why we chose these rather subtle errors and not the obvious ones. And 60% of all the corrected errors in our corpus analysis are subtle register errors. And there's very little agreement on these errors. So only 18% of those errors that were introduced were actually corrected. And there's no significant hierarchy during error recognition, apart from that effect on the I-key span. So our suggestion is that efficiency gains could be made by increasing the hierarchical importance of errors, both in terms of how they are processed and to the extent that they are actually corrected. And this could potentially lead to reduced also cognitive effort. So if you spend more time on the errors that actually matter and less time on those that actually don't matter that much, this could lead to cognitive and efficiency gains. And to conclude, this is one participant's eyes moving across the screen while correcting mistakes. Questions?
These were the 80 slides.
Yes, 81.
That's good.